I used to believe the forest kept no secrets from me. That belief lasted right up until the night I realized the pines were capable of remembering things no living person should ever hear spoken aloud. Even now, after years on the job, I can still feel the breath of that first moment, like the woods themselves exhaled just to warn me I'd stepped into a story older than my own name. My name isn't important, not yet. All you really need to know is that I was 34 that first year I worked the northern district of the Green Mountain National Forest, tucked into the folds of Vermont, where the old-growth pines grow tall and tight. The locals around there still whisper about things that walk between the trunks after the fog settles. They pass stories across diner counters and front porches, stories they warn you about only if you're the kind of person who listens. And I was. I listened too well. Maybe that's why those stories found me. I grew up far from Vermont, in a place where trees were small enough to see over, where you could track a storm coming from miles away. But the Green Mountains swallowed the sky. On cloudy days, the canopy thickened so much it felt like night arrived early. My first week on duty, I remember standing on a ridge at dawn, frost crunching under my boots, the smell of pine sap so sharp it stung my eyes. The cold sank through my jacket and into my bones, but something else stirred beneath that chill, a quiet unease I couldn't name. In Ranger School, they told us fear came from ignorance and inexperience. Learn enough, see enough, and your nerves settle. That was half right. Experience just teaches you what's worth fearing. My station was small, one cabin, one radio tower, one garage barely holding a decades-old snowcat. I worked with 3 other rangers, Hillard, a 5th-generation Vermonter with a permanent frown carved into his features, Maya, a hiker-turned-ranger whose optimism annoyed people until they needed her, and Rowan, our supervisor, a quiet man whose eyes never seemed to stop scanning the tree line. Rowan moved like someone who expected the forest to answer back when he stepped into it. He gave me my first warning, my first week. "Stick to the marked trails for a while," he said, tightening the strap on his pack. "Not because you'll get lost, because the woods haven't learned you yet." I chuckled at that, but he didn't smile. His gaze drifted toward the pines behind the ranger station, and I swear the wind slowed like it wanted to hear what he'd say next. "They remember people," he muttered, "and sometimes they remember wrong." At the time, I thought it was poetic nonsense. But by the end of that month, his words would sink into me like roots. It started with the knocking. Every cabin in the district had thick wooden walls reinforced for winter storms, but sound has a way of slipping through the cracks in these woods. The nights were colder than I expected, and even with the stove burning, the air settled heavy and damp. One evening after a late patrol, I heard what I thought was a branch tapping against the side of my cabin, a slow, deliberate knock 3 times. Then silence. I stepped outside with my flashlight, breath fogging in the chill. The forest was still. No wind, no branches swaying, just the sound of my pulse in my ears. I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. The next night it came again. 3 knocks, little pauses between each one, like someone deciding whether they really wanted me to answer. I mentioned it to Hillard. He shrugged. "You're hearing things," he said. "Old cabins moan, air pressure shifts, wood expands. Happens. But cabins don't knock in patterns." On the 4th night, the knocks didn't stop at 3. They continued. Slow, patient, unhurried. 12 in total, each one louder than the last. By the time I opened the door, every ridge in my spine felt wired with electricity. The clearing stood empty. The only tracks in the thin frost were my own. That was the first story. The first time my instincts whispered that something wasn't right. But I resisted believing it. Denial is a strange comfort. We cling to it until it cuts us. A week later, Rowan sent me to check on a missing hiker reported near Somerset Reservoir. Autumn had just begun, and the air smelled of wet leaves and cooling earth. I drove as far as I could and hiked the rest, scanning for footprints, broken twigs, shredded bark, anything. The forest was quiet that morning, too quiet, as if the wildlife had pressed itself deeper into the underbrush. About 5 miles in, I found something strange. Pine needles scattered over an opening in the ground. A sinkhole, or cave entrance, partially obscured. The hiker hadn't mentioned going off trail, but the indentation looked fresh. I kneeled, swept aside the needles, and felt a gust of cold air brush against my face. It didn't smell like earth. It smelled metallic, like blood left in snow. Something inside me tightened. Instinct. That old animal sense we try to deny because we're civilized. I felt the forest watching me, waiting to see if I'd climb down. Instead, I marked the location and kept moving. I found the missing hiker 2 hours later, sitting beside a stream, shivering but unharmed. When I asked what happened, he avoided eye contact. "I heard something," he whispered. "Someone calling my name." His name was Leon. He wasn't local. Most locals will tell you the forest calls only to those who weren't born among these pines. "What did it sound like?" I asked. He shook his head. "Like me." I stared at him. "You mean someone who sounded like you?" "No." He swallowed hard. "It sounded like my own voice." Fear tightened his words. His hands trembled, and when I asked why he followed it, he looked up at me with hollow eyes. "Because it knew things about me," he said. "Things I never told anyone." I escorted him back, radioed for medical support, and filled out the report. Rowan read through it quietly and set it aside without a word. "You didn't tell me there were caves in that area," I said. "There are caves everywhere in these mountains," he replied. "Some marked, some not." "When were they surveyed?" He gave me a long, steady look. "Some things don't need surveying." Something in his tone chilled me, not the words, the resignation behind them. In the weeks that followed, small things kept happening. Footsteps pacing outside my cabin at night, shadows moving behind trees when the wind was still, whispers drifting through the undergrowth, too faint to make out but too intentional to ignore. I kept rationalizing it. Animals. Weather. Fatigue. But one evening I smelled something odd, like cold stone mixed with something sweet, almost floral. Pine resin, except stronger, sharper. It lingered just long enough to make my skin prickle. Then it vanished. The locals warned me about that scent later. They said, "You smell it when the forest is paying attention." One night, while closing up the station alone, I found Rowan sitting outside on the steps, staring into the dark like it held a question he couldn't answer. "You ever hear knocking in the middle of the night?" I asked him. He didn't turn his head. "Everyone hears knocking. Not everyone admits it." "So what is it? Animals?" "No," he exhaled slowly. "It's them." "Who?" "The ones the pines remember." A tremor ran through me. His voice wasn't dramatic or fearful. It was tired, like he'd been carrying the truth for years and had given up outrunning it. He finally looked at me. "There are stories here the forest won't let die. Sometimes it repeats what it remembers. Sometimes it repeats what it wants." I felt the weight of his words settle on my chest, but before I could ask anything else, he stood and walked inside, leaving me with the sound of wind sifting through the needles. That night, I dreamed of the cave, not the way I'd seen it. Darker, deeper. I heard dripping water, smelled the metallic chill, and felt the weight of the earth pressing down. Something moved in that dream, something too large to be human, too soft in its footsteps to be animal. When it breathed, the walls pulsed like living flesh. And far above me, the pines shivered. I woke with that scent in my nose again. Cold stone, pine resin, something floral beneath it, and then the knocking started. Not 3 knocks, not 12, just one. Slow, deliberate, like a reminder, like the forest telling me it hadn't forgotten, like something beneath the pines was waiting for me to listen. I didn't open the door after that single knock. I just sat there in the dark, every muscle wound tight, listening to my own heartbeat hammer through the silence. It felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath with me. I waited for a second knock, or footsteps, or the scraping of branches across the siding. But nothing followed. The stillness outside was absolute, oppressive, as though the pines had leaned in close to hear how I might react. After nearly an hour, I realized the knocking had never been a request. It was an announcement. Something wanted me to know it was out there. Something wanted to be remembered. I barely slept, and when morning came, the world outside felt wrong, too bright, too quiet. The frost on the ground hadn't been disturbed. No footprints, no animal tracks. The only evidence that anything had happened was the lingering sense that the woods were watching me from behind the tree line. I tried to shake it off during morning rounds. Maya rode with me that day, her auburn hair tied back beneath her cap, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. She hummed a tune under her breath, a habit she had when she sensed I was tense. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. "I heard something last night." She glanced at me. "What kind of something?" "A knock." Her humming stopped. Silence filled the cab of the truck. I noticed her fingers tighten on her thermos. "On your door?" she asked quietly. "Yeah." She didn't respond at first. The road ahead curled through dense pine, the canopy filtering the weak sunlight into fractured green beams. I watched her throat tighten before she asked, "How many?" "One." She exhaled sharply. "That's worse." My skin prickled. "Why?" Maya swallowed, her voice low. "Locals say 1 knock means the forest wants your attention, 3 means it wants you to follow. But 1, they say that's how it tests people." I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my chest. "Tests them how?" "By seeing if you can ignore it. And if you don't?" She didn't answer, and I didn't push her. Something in her silence felt older than superstition. We spent most of the morning repairing a broken trail sign and clearing storm debris, but the unease followed me like a shadow. Every time the wind shifted, I caught that scent again. Cold stone mixed with pine resin and something sweet, like wildflowers crushed underfoot. A scent too clean to be natural, too pointed to be accidental. Around midday, Rowan radioed us. "Need you at the North Ridge trailhead," he said. "Hiker report." We reached the trailhead 20 minutes later. An older couple stood beside their car, both pale and shaking, the woman gripping the man's arm with white-knuckled fear. Rowan was already speaking to them, notebook in hand. "They said they heard someone screaming," Rowan told us after a quick nod of acknowledgement. A man's voice, deep, kept shouting for help. "Did they check it out?" Maya asked. The couple's reaction answered for him. They recoiled slightly, eyes darting toward the dense woods as if something might burst out at any second. Rowan continued. "They said it sounded wrong, like it was under the ground." My heart lurched. The cave. I tried to keep my face neutral, but Rowan's eyes flicked to me, just for a second, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. "We'll check it out," he said. The couple left as quickly as they could, tires skidding on the gravel as they drove away. We followed the ridge trail in silence. The midday sun filtered weakly through the canopy, scattering fractured light across the forest floor. Birds were conspicuously absent. Even the usual rustle of small animals scurrying through underbrush had faded. It was too quiet again. When the trail curved toward a steep incline, Rowan slowed his pace. "Sound carries strangely out here," he said. "Echoes move sideways instead of up. Don't assume direction. Don't assume distance. Is this near where I found that sinkhole?" I asked carefully. Rowan didn't stop walking. "It's all connected." "What is?" I pressed. He glanced back at me, and for a moment I saw real hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't scared, but he was weighing something, deciding how much truth a newcomer could survive. "The caves," he said finally, "the ones no one maps, the ones no one should." Maya shivered visibly. She didn't look at him. We found the cave entrance, or sinkhole, or whatever it was, more open than before. The pine needles I'd brushed aside had blown away, revealing a wider gap in the earth. Cold air seeped upward in a steady pulse. The metallic scent was stronger this time, almost suffocating. Rowan crouched near the edge, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam didn't hit bottom. The darkness below crawled up like ink, swallowing the light. "Hello?" he called. His voice echoed, first normally, then distorted, trailing upward like a whisper dragged over stone. A second later, a voice called back. Help, not shouted, not panicked, just spoken, flat, toneless, as though repeating a word it had heard but didn't understand. Help. Maya grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my sleeve hard enough to hurt. "That's not human," she whispered. Rowan didn't argue. The word echoed again. Help. Then a pause. Then in a voice that sounded too much like my own, come down. My stomach lurched. My breath caught in my throat, and suddenly the forest around me felt too tight, too close. The scent intensified until it coated the back of my tongue like something rotten wrapped in sweetness. Rowan stood slowly. We're done here. What about the voice? I asked. It wasn't a voice, he said. Not the way you mean. As we started back down the trail, Maya kept glancing over her shoulder, her face drained of color. I tried to follow Rowan's lead and stay focused, but the forest had changed. Its silence wasn't empty anymore. It was watching. The light through the branches seemed dimmer, even though the sun hadn't moved. Every footstep felt heavier, as though the earth beneath us had thickened. When we reached the trailhead, Rowan stopped walking and turned to me. You need to understand something, he said quietly. The forest doesn't mimic voices. The caves do. And the caves are what? I asked. Old, he said. Too old. And not empty. That night, long after the others had gone home, I stayed in the ranger station reviewing old search and rescue reports. Patterns began to emerge. Cases where people heard calls or knocks before they vanished. Cases where hikers were found days later with no memory of why they'd left the trail. Reports of caves appearing in places they hadn't been marked before. One entry in particular stopped me cold. A ranger, decades ago, had reported hearing knocking on his cabin door 4 nights in a row. He described the same scent I'd been smelling. The forest had been trying to learn his voice, he wrote. The words unsettled me so deeply I had to stand and walk outside just to breathe. The woods were dark, the wind calm, the pines unmoving, but the silence was wrong again. I heard something shift behind me, soft, deliberate, like a footstep sinking into moss. I turned, flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing moved, but the scent was there again. Stronger, closer. Then I felt it. Not a touch, not a breath, just awareness. Like something standing just out of sight, leaning close enough to graze my thoughts. The quiet of the forest thickened, tightened, and then knock. Not on my cabin door, behind me, on a tree. One slow, deliberate knock. I froze, breath locked in my chest. The forest wasn't repeating a memory anymore. It was practicing, learning. Trying my name in its mouth without yet knowing how to say it. I didn't turn around right away. Some instinct older than language told me that acknowledging the knock, even with a glance, would be a kind of permission. So I stood still, staring into the dark ahead of me, trying to breathe through the rising heat in my chest. The pines creaked softly in the windless night. My ears strained for footsteps, for breath, for anything, but no sound came, only silence, thick, expectant. When I finally forced myself to turn, nothing was there, just trees, hundreds of them, standing still as stone pillars, each trunk dark and straight against the dim starlight. My flashlight jittered in my hand as I swept it across the forest floor. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign anything had moved at all. But the smell was there again, cold stone, sharp resin, and something underneath it all, like a deep sweetness that didn't belong in the open air. A smell that made the back of my throat tighten. I backed toward the station door slowly, never taking my eyes off the trees until the latch clicked shut behind me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the cabin felt intentional. Every groan of wood felt like something shifting its weight, deciding when to knock again. I stayed awake until sunrise, watching the window, afraid to blink. When I reported the incident the next morning, Rowan listened without speaking. He didn't laugh or question me. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "It's early for this," he said quietly. "For what?" "For the forest to take interest." I felt the floor tilt under his words. Why would it be interested in me? "Some people," he said slowly, "the pines watch more closely that maybe it's instinct, maybe it's memory." His eyes drifted toward the window. "Maybe it's just hungry." His tone carried no drama, no embellishment, just worn-out truth. I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. He only nodded for me to get back to work. But all day I felt eyes on me, not human, not animal, not anything I could name. The feeling didn't fade, not even when I tried to drown myself in trail checks, paperwork, radio calls, anything that kept me out of the woods. That evening, Maya stopped by my cabin with a thermos of hot cider. Her hands shook when she handed it to me. It happened to me my second year. The knock, only once. "What did you do?" I asked. "I ignored it," she said. "I stayed in bed, pulled the covers over my head like a kid. I didn't even breathe until sunrise." "Did it stop after that?" Her jaw tightened. "For a while." That "for a while" landed like a stone in my gut. She looked at me then, really looked. "You need to be careful. Whatever's in these woods, it doesn't pull everyone in, just the ones who listen." I didn't sleep again that night, and if I drifted off at all, it wasn't rest. The forest was seeped into my dreams, the scent of stone and resin clinging to the edges of my mind. Somewhere underground, something breathed in a slow, unnatural rhythm. I could feel the air shifting around it, cold and heavy. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. No hikers reported anything strange, no missing persons, no odd noises on patrol, but quiet in these woods never means peace. It means something is waiting. On the fourth day, just as dusk settled over the pines, Rowan called me into the station. "I need you to accompany me tonight," he said. "Where?" He hesitated, the weight of his silence filling the room. "North Hollow." My pulse jumped. "Why? What happened?" "A camper reported lights moving in the trees, high up, too high." "What kind of lights?" He looked at me. "Lanterns. Lanterns don't float 30 feet above the ground." We drove out under a sky full of low, heavy clouds. The forest darkened faster than usual, reducing the road to a thin, pale ribbon between walls of trees. When we reached the trailhead, Rowan killed the engine and stepped out without a word. The air was colder here, a wet chill seeping up from the earth. I smelled pine sap and damp leaves, but underneath it was something else, a metallic cold like a cave bearing its breath to the surface. We hiked in silence, our headlamps cutting narrow tunnels of white through the dark. After a mile, Rowan stopped abruptly. He pointed upward through the branches. I saw it immediately, a faint, warm glow, like the flicker of a fire lantern drifting between the pines. It moved slowly, almost lazily, and for a moment I thought it might be a trick of the eyes. Then it stopped, completely still, hovering between two trunks. Another light appeared to the left, then a third, 3 lantern-like glows hanging in the branches. "How is that possible?" I whispered. "It isn't," Rowan said. We stayed frozen there for a moment, neither of us breathing. The lights didn't blink or flicker. They remained perfectly steady, perfectly still, as though watching. Then one of them slid sideways, smoothly, soundlessly, like it was gliding on an invisible track. My breath stilled. "Rowan, back away," he whispered, slowly. We stepped backward in perfect unison. The lights didn't move, they simply hovered there, patient and unblinking. But then a sound drifted down from the branches, soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. A low hum, almost like someone exhaling a single slow note. Rowan grabbed my arm. "Don't look up again." "What is that?" "A warning." We retreated until the lights disappeared into the branches behind us. Only when the last trace of glow was gone did Rowan release my arm and breathe again. "What are those things?" I asked. "They aren't things," he said. "They're signs of what? Presence." His face was pale under the headlamp glow. I'd worked with him long enough to know he wasn't easily rattled. This wasn't fear, it was recognition. When we reached the truck, he finally spoke more clearly. "The locals used to call them watchers," he said. "Lights that appear when the forest is awake. Not alive, awake. The watchers are part of the forest? No, but they're drawn to it, like moths to flame. And the caves?" His lips tightened. "Everything in these woods is connected to the caves. Everything." The drive back was silent, but as we approached the ranger station, something caught my eye, a shadow standing between 2 trees at the edge of the lot. It wasn't moving. It wasn't slumped like an animal. Its outline was wrong, too tall, too still. "That shape," I began. "I see it." We didn't slow down. Rowan drove straight past it, eyes fixed forward. But in that split second, I saw the shape turn its head toward us, not with curiosity, but with recognition. the same way someone looks up when they hear their name spoken in a crowded room. We reached the station, slammed the doors behind us, and locked everything. Rowan paced, rubbing his temples. "It's getting close," he muttered. "Is this about the knock? The cave? The lights?" "It's all the same story," he said, "just different chapters." He stopped pacing and looked at me with a heaviness that made my stomach drop. "You asked why the forest took interest in you," he said. "I think I know now. Why?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because something down there remembered your voice before you ever spoke it aloud." A chill swept through me so sharp my knees nearly buckled. Before I could speak, the lights in the station flickered. Once, twice, then the radio crackled to life. Not with static, not with a call sign, with a voice. My voice. "Help me." I staggered back. Rowan lunged toward the radio and yanked the power cord from the wall, but the voice continued, fading into the air like an echo trapped in the building. "Help me. Come down." The same tone, the same cadence, the same flatness from the cave, except now it wasn't repeating, it was inviting, and it knew exactly who it was speaking to. Rowan shoved the radio into a drawer as if burying it would muffle whatever had just spoken through it. But the cabin still vibrated with the echo of that voice. My voice, or the forest's attempt at it. Hearing your own tone come from something unseen is like feeling a cold finger trace the inside of your skull. It doesn't hurt, not physically, but it leaves you hollow, unsettled, as though something has rearranged itself inside you without permission. I leaned against the wall, trying to slow my breathing. "That wasn't an echo," I whispered. "It was speaking." Rowan didn't deny it. "It isn't trying to imitate you anymore. It's trying to use you." "Use me how?" He hesitated, the air thickening with unspoken truth. "To lure others, or to open something it can't open alone." A chill crawled up my arms. "You said the caves are old. What's down there?" He rubbed his forehead hard like the words themselves hurt. "Something that remembers. Something that listens for people like you. It hears your steps before you make them, learns your voice before you speak, and when it wants you close, it uses that knowledge against you." "And the Watchers?" I asked. "The lantern lights?" "Not the same thing," he said, "but they show up around the places where the boundary's thin." "Boundary?" I echoed. "Between what?" His answer came in a whisper. "Between surface and below." Lightning crashed outside, sudden and violent. Thunder followed a second later, shaking the windows. Rain slammed the roof in sheets. I flinched at the noise, but Rowan didn't move. He stared at the radio drawer like he expected it to call out again. "We're not going back to that cave," I said. "Right?" Rowan's silence was an answer. "You've been there before," I said slowly. He didn't look at me. "Once." "What happened?" He finally met my gaze, and something in his expression, a quiet, exhausted grief, told me he'd been carrying this story far longer than he wanted. "Before you arrived," he said, "we had another ranger. Young, sharp, local. He heard knocking one night, ignored it, same as Maya did. A few days later, he followed screams into the woods. He said he thought he recognized the voice, a family member he lost years earlier. I swallowed hard, waiting. He found a cave," Rowan continued, "just like you did, but different. They change, open and close, move. Sometimes they're where they shouldn't be." "And," I asked, "he went in. I felt the temperature in the room drop. They found him 2 days later," Rowan whispered, "but not fully and not all at once. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching." "What do you mean?" "He came back in pieces, not torn apart, not physically, just wrong. The part of him that made decisions, gone. The part that recognized us, gone. He stared at the trees like he expected them to tell him who he was, and he kept repeating something." "What?" "It learned my name." My pulse hammered in my ears. "Did he survive?" I asked. "No," Rowan said. "Not in any way that mattered." A heavy silence fell between us. The rain outside softened to a steady hiss. Lightning flickered, illuminating the cabin in pale flashes. My mind kept circling back to the cave, the voice, the Watchers, the single knock on my cabin door. It all felt threaded together, a web tightening around me. But one question pushed its way through the fear. "Why me?" I whispered. "Why did it choose me?" Rowan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Some people hear the forest, not the wind, not the animals. The forest. You felt something your first week, didn't you? That unease, that watching. I nodded. It noticed you, he said, and once it notices someone, it doesn't forget. A sudden crack echoed outside, sharp, clean, like a tree splitting. We both froze. Another sound followed. Not thunder, not a falling branch, knocking, slow, deliberate. On the side of the station, I felt my blood turn cold. Rowan stood instantly, motioning me back without taking his eyes off the wall. 3 knocks, each more forceful than the last. Rowan moved to the window, staying low, lifting just enough to peer outside. His breath hitched. "Oh, God," he murmured. I joined him carefully. Outside, standing in the rain, was a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving. But it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid. It stood perfectly still, rain running down its silhouette like water over stone. The darkness obscured its face, but the outline was unmistakable, a shape the height of 2 men. Shoulders hunched like a creature made for caves, not open air. "What is that?" I whispered. "Not a thing that belongs up here," Rowan said. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, but something in its stance was unmistakable. It was waiting. The lightning flashed again, and for a split second I saw its eyes, reflective, pale, not like an animal's eyes, but like 2 smooth stones catching light from a cave mouth. Then a voice rose over the rain. My voice, "Come down." Rowan grabbed my shoulder. "Don't listen to it." But the voice kept repeating, louder, clearer, threading itself through the storm. "Come down, come down, come down." Each repetition sounded more natural, more like me, as though the forest was perfecting the imitation, as though my real voice was being overwritten. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voice wasn't just sound, it was memory, thought, pressure on the inside of my skull. "Come down." Rowan dragged me away from the window and shoved the station's emergency cabinet open. He pulled out a flare gun and snapped it into readiness. "I'm going outside," he said. "Stay here." "No," I said. "You can't go out there alone." His expression softened. "If it came for me, it wouldn't be using your voice." Lightning cracked overhead, throwing the room into stark shadows. The knocking started again, this time on the back wall, then the front, then the roof. Not random, coordinated, surrounding us. Something wasn't just calling me, it was closing in. Rowan forced the door open and disappeared into the storm before I could stop him. The moment he stepped outside, the knocks ceased. Silence swallowed the world. I pressed myself against the window, trying to see through the downpour. Rowan moved like a ghost between the trees, his flare gun raised. The tall figure was gone. Then Rowan stopped, his head tilted. He was listening. I couldn't hear what he heard, not at first. The rain masked everything, but then it broke through, a scream, not human, not animal, a deep, resonant howl that shook the ground. Then another, Rowan's voice. Except he wasn't calling for help. He was repeating 2 words over and over, my name and the word down. No, not repeating, practicing, learning, perfecting. It wasn't Rowan's voice. It was the forest trying him on the way it had tried me. Something in the dark had taken him. The watchers flickered into existence in the branches, 3 soft amber glows shifting between the trunks. Not warning this time, witnessing, urging me. The storm raged thicker, the forest loomed closer, and deep beneath the earth, the cave breathed in a slow, patient rhythm. "Come down," my legs trembled. My mind fractured between terror and instinct. Every fear I'd buried clawed its way to the surface. Fear of failing, fear of being swallowed whole by something nameless, fear of losing the man who'd tried to protect me, even when he knew he couldn't protect himself. I stepped outside. The rain hit me like needles. The scent of stone and resin filled my lungs. The watchers hovered above me, drifting forward, guiding, and the forest called again. My voice, Rowan's voice, voices I didn't recognize, all weaving into a single command. "Come down." But as I stood there soaked and shaking, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe courage. Maybe the forest hadn't learned everything about me after all. I turned away from the watchers, away from the cave, away from the thing imitating the voices of the people it wanted. The forest screamed, an unearthly, fractured roar that rattled branches and sent flocks of ravens exploding from the canopy. Shadows lunged between the trees like arms grasping for my ankles. The ground trembled beneath me as though the cave itself was trying to rise. But I kept walking. Not running. Walking. Step after step, refusing to turn back. The screams grew fainter, the shadows retreated, and the watchers blinked out one by one, dimming like dying embers. By the time I reached the far side of the ridge, the forest had gone silent, completely. A silence so deep it felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. But the pines weren't done with me, not yet. When I collapsed near the trailhead, soaked and shaking, something soft brushed my cheek. A pine needle, fresh, placed gently, not fallen, a reminder, a promise. The forest had let me go, but it had not forgotten me, and it never would. Because once the pines learn your voice, they never stop trying to use it, and they never stop whispering your name. I've learned that the forest never introduces itself with silence. It greets you with a memory, one it chooses, not one you ask for. And on the night everything changed, the memory that rose in me wasn't a comforting one. It was the strange, heavy feeling I had as a kid standing at the threshold of a cave in the foothills, staring into the kind of darkness that seems to know your name before you speak it. I didn't run then. I should have. And I wonder now if that's the reason the pines still whisper to me, calling back to a moment I never truly walked away from. My name doesn't matter as much as the years I've carried in these woods. I've been a ranger since I was 23, long enough to see seasons turn entire valleys into mirrors of who you become when you're alone too long. I'm 41 now, stationed in a stretch of pine forest in northern Washington state that locals call the Boundary. They say it marks the border between the living and something older, something patient, something that watches from the tree line even when you think you're alone. Most days, it's a quiet job, checking trails, clearing debris, talking tourists out of bad ideas. But every ranger in regions like mine has a handful of stories we don't tell in training sessions or over campfire chats. They sit deeper in a place no handbook prepares you for. And though the land doesn't owe us answers, it certainly gives us warnings. I just didn't always know how to hear them. I started noticing things my first winter on the job when the forest seemed to breathe with the cold. Pines groaned under snow, branches cracked with the weight of stillness, and sometimes, late at night, the wind carried a sound that wasn't quite an animal and wasn't quite human. A call stretched too thin, echoing like it came from behind the trees rather than among them. When I told old locals about it, they just nodded slowly, the way people nod when you finally notice a truth they assumed you already knew. One of them, a widow named Marcy who'd lived by the ridge her whole life, told me something I didn't forget. She said the pines held on to grief the way water holds to cold. Once inside, it never fully thaws. She said the forest remembers every scream it has ever absorbed. I thought she was speaking in metaphors. Now I'm not so sure. I didn't grow up superstitious. I grew up practical, disciplined, even stubborn. But I also grew up near enough to the mountains to know that strange things don't need permission to exist. You can rationalize every sound, every shadow, every cold breath on your neck, but that doesn't mean the explanation fits. And it doesn't mean you've convinced yourself. It just means you're trying to stay in control. Maybe that's why I became a ranger. I wanted to be the one who understood the land, not the one afraid of it. But that belief had been crumbling long before the night I first saw the shape in the trees. Back then, it was just small things, a pattern of missing hikers whose tracks vanished mid-stride, a scent of iron that settled thick across the valley before storms, the occasional report of something walking parallel to campers, but never showing itself. You learn to categorize these events: misadventure, weather patterns, wildlife behavior. Except some patterns don't belong in any folder. One early spring morning years ago, I was patrolling after a windstorm when I found a young man sitting in the middle of the trail, covered in dirt, but with no injuries. His lips were blue, his eyes wide, and he couldn't stop shaking. He kept saying the same thing. It followed me from the ridge. He didn't describe an animal. He didn't describe a person. He didn't describe anything recognizable at all. Just that it was tall enough to cast a shadow across the ravine, and that it breathed like it had more than one set of lungs. Search and rescue wrote it off as hypothermia-induced hallucination. But when he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks and whispered numb, "Don't let it know your name," a part of me froze. Not because of what he said, but how. It was the tone of someone remembering something, not imagining it. Still, I spent years rationalizing every strange moment that followed. You have to, or the forest wins. The first time I heard the knocking, I was staying overnight at Firewatch Cabin 3, about 8 miles up the North Ridge. Snow had fallen early that year, and I'd hiked in to check the roof integrity and restock emergency supplies. The cabin was quiet. Wooden walls swollen slightly from moisture, fireplace crackling with the kind of heat that never reaches your bones completely. Around midnight, as the wind curled through the pines, I heard a hollow knock on the door. 2 knocks. A pause. Then a third, softer than the first 2, like a fingertip instead of a hand. I thought it was a lost hiker. Happens more often than you'd expect. People get disoriented in the snow, especially at night. So I opened the door without hesitation. But no one was there. Fresh snow lay untouched. No tracks, not even disturbed powder. Just a stillness so absolute it made me acutely aware of my breathing. I closed the door, told myself it was thermal contraction in the wood. But before I could even step away, the knocking came again. On the back wall this time. 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. I froze. Not out of fear, but confusion. Wood doesn't contract on 2 separate walls in 2 different rhythms. Something was moving around the cabin. Something silent enough not to crunch snow. Something that knew exactly where the walls were weakest. I didn't sleep that night. But I told no one. If you share stories like that too early in your career, people look at you differently, like you're already cracking. It wasn't until years later that an elder from a nearby tribal community told me that some things in these woods don't enter through doors. They enter through your attention. They tap until you acknowledge them. And if you respond, even with curiosity, they learn you, they remember you, and they wait. I wasn't ready to hear that then. I'm not sure I'm ready now, but I can tell you this with certainty. Fear doesn't start with the unknown. Fear starts when the unknown starts knowing you. And after that night in the cabin, I began to feel watched in ways that didn't match any animal behavior I'd studied. Sometimes I'd be clearing a trail and feel a breath of warm air on the back of my neck despite the temperature being near freezing. Sometimes the pines would sway in a wind I couldn't feel. Sometimes I'd smell something like wet fur and soil, even on dry days. The locals had a name for it, though they didn't say it often. They called it the Tall One of the Boundary, an old spirit, a guardian to some, a predator to others. Stories described it as part man, part beast, towering enough to brush lower branches with its head. Some compared it to the Yeti myths from the north, but leaner, quieter, smarter. Something that could mimic sounds, including human voices, if it wanted to. I didn't believe those stories. But denial is a fragile shelter. and the forest knows how to pry apart anything flimsy. It starts with a nail loosening, a hinge bending, a whisper slipping through the smallest crack in your resolve. And as the years rolled on, I learned that ignoring something watching you doesn't make it lose interest. It just makes it study you longer. The first time I saw prints, real, undeniable prints, I was patrolling alone along the western stretch of Boundary Ridge. Fresh snowfall had turned the world into a blank page, and every track jumped out like ink. Deer, elk, fox, even a bobcat near the creek bed. Ordinary, comforting in their familiarity. But then I reached a clearing and saw a set of footprints that didn't belong to any creature I knew. They were enormous, each one easily twice the size of my boot and spaced far apart, as if whatever made them had a stride meant for distances beyond human ability. The oddest part wasn't their size, but their shape. Not fully human, but close enough to unsettle me. The heel was elongated, the toes splayed wider than ours, almost hand-like. And the weight distribution was wrong. Too even, too light for something so large. I crouched beside them, the cold biting through my gloves as I traced the edge of one print. Snowflakes dripped into the depression, melting almost instantly, as if the ground still held heat from whatever had passed through minutes earlier. I should have radioed it in, logged it, documented it like any professional would, but something in me, some old instinct that felt older than training, told me not to. It felt like discovering an unmarked grave, sacred in its own unsettling way, or cursed. So I kept walking, but the prints kept appearing over the years, always after storms or during nights when the wind shifted strangely, always leading away from the boundary, never toward it, like something pacing the edge of an invisible line. I told myself I wasn't scared. I told myself I was still in control. But fear doesn't come all at once. It trickles through you like meltwater, filling low places first. The first story I'm willing to admit shook me happened on a fog-drenched morning in late autumn. I was escorting a pair of campers, two brothers in their 30s, back to the main trailhead after they'd wandered off path. The fog was thick enough to blur the edges of the world, turning trees into smudges of charcoal and the ground into shifting shapes. The brothers were arguing quietly behind me, their breath clouding the air. They walked close, too close, like men who had seen something they couldn't explain. I kept glancing back, ready to reassure them, but before I could speak, one of them gripped my arm. "Listen," he whispered. I thought he meant the wind, but then I heard it too, a low, rhythmic thump far away but steady, like footsteps, heavy ones. Not running, not wandering, just following. We stopped. The sound stopped. We moved. The sound returned. I tried to rationalize it, echoes, animals, shifting earth, but each explanation fell apart as quickly as I formed it. It wasn't on either side of us. It wasn't ahead. It was behind us, always behind us. The fog felt too dense, like it was hiding the source on purpose. At one point, the younger brother muttered, "It's matching us." And he was right. Every time we paused, the thumping paused. Every time we quickened our pace, it did too. I led them off path, a risky move given visibility, but better than letting panic eat them alive. I told them to breathe, that it was likely just an elk. They didn't believe me. I didn't believe me. Then the thumping stopped entirely. No fading, no drifting, just silence. We walked for another 10 minutes before the older brother said, "Thank you, Ranger." His voice trembled in a way he didn't try to hide. Whatever he'd heard, it wasn't just fear of being lost. Something had followed them long before I found them. When I returned later to survey the area, the fog had lifted, revealing the forest in sharp, brittle detail. No prints, no marks, nothing disturbed, as if the morning itself had been a different season, belonging to another world. Locals whispered about things like that. They warned hikers not to listen to every footstep, because some echoes belong to spirits that mimic the living. They said the pines absorb tragedies and sometimes replay them to those who wander too close to old wounds. I dismissed that too. You don't realize how stubborn you are until the truth starts bending the world around you. The second story, the one that marked the beginning of my unraveling, happened 2 years later. This one wasn't about sound. It was scent. I was responding to reports of a missing hunter near Rockfall Basin. He was experienced, cautious, not the type to get turned around. But his son said he'd been acting strange the night before he disappeared. Distracted, unfocused, as if listening to someone who wasn't there. They'd camped near a stretch of pines people generally avoided. Locals said it was where the forest held its breath, whatever that meant. I hiked in alone, since the terrain was too tight for a team. The deeper I went, the colder the air became, despite it being early summer. Not just temperature cold, emotional cold. The kind that sinks into your ribs. The kind that makes every instinct in your body whisper, "Turn back." Then I smelled it, a heavy, metallic scent, like rust or blood, but also something earthy and wet, like soil after a storm. It coated the air thickly, clinging to the back of my throat. I covered my mouth, but it didn't help. The smell followed me like a presence. I found the hunter's pack near a tree trunk, untouched, as if he'd set it down for a moment. His footprints circled the area in strange patterns, tight loops, then long strides, then abrupt stops, as if he'd been pacing, listening, confused. And on one tree trunk at shoulder height were long scratches, 4 parallel lines carved deep into the bark, too deep for a knife, too high for a bear, too clean for chance. The scent grew stronger until my eyes watered. That's when I realized something chilling. The smell wasn't coming from the scratches, it was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, expecting an animal, but nothing was there, just pines, still, watching. The scent then faded instantly, gone in a gust of wind, as if held by something that had just moved past me. I never found the hunter. Not a trace. His son still leaves offerings at the basin every year, tobacco, sage, cedar, not because he believes his father will return, but because he wants the forest to know he remembers him. Locals told me later that's how you keep the woods from keeping a soul completely. The third story, that one carved itself into me. It involved temperature, and it was the first time I felt panicked, truly panicked in a way that left a mark. I was patrolling a cave system near the southern cliffs during late afternoon. The caves there are narrow, jagged, and wet, more like deep wounds in the mountain than tourist attractions. I'd always felt uneasy around caves. They remind me too much of being a kid at that threshold, staring into the dark that stares back. But duty is duty. I stepped inside one cave only about 10 feet, flashlight sweeping across the uneven stone. It smelled like cold water and time. My breath fogged instantly. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not naturally. It plunged. My skin prickled. My breath crystallized. I could feel the cold pressing against me almost physically, like a presence entering the space. My instincts screamed to move, but I stayed, frozen by a fear I hadn't felt since childhood. Behind me, in the mouth of the cave, I heard a soft crunch. Snow. Except it wasn't snowing. Then something exhaled. Long, slow, and far, far too close. There's a kind of cold you can hide from, wind, rain, snow. Then there's the kind of cold that finds you, no matter how tightly you wrap your jacket or how quickly you try to escape. This cold felt like fingers sliding beneath my skin, reaching for something pulsing beneath the fear I was trying too hard to swallow. That exhale behind me didn't belong to anything I'd ever encountered in the wild. It wasn't the sharp, short breath of a deer. It wasn't the heavy rumble of a bear. It was steady, deliberate, like something was announcing its presence in the simplest, most unnerving way possible by sharing the air with me. I didn't turn around right away. Every instinct told me not to. I stood in that cave, my flashlight trembling in my hand, staring at the narrow walls that suddenly felt alive, as though they were leaning in to listen. The sound of that breath moved through me, slid down my spine, forced my heartbeat into my ears. Another exhale, closer. Something brushed the cave floor behind me, faint and slow. Not quite a footstep, more like a weight shifting from one limb to another. The temperature plunged again, and for a moment it felt like the world was tipping. My vision tightened. My breath came out in clouds, but the air swallowing them was darker than the cave itself. I finally turned. There was nothing. Just the jagged silhouette of the cave entrance, the sunlight outside dimming as clouds rolled in. But the space felt occupied, densely, invisibly occupied. Every nerve in my body fired in the same direction. Run. I didn't sprint. I forced myself to move steadily, flashlight raised, steps controlled. Panic makes people sloppy, and sloppy is how you disappear in places like this. But as soon as I stepped out of the cave, the temperature snapped back to normal. A warm breeze brushed my face, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. My breath stopped fogging. When I looked back, the cave mouth seemed smaller. Or maybe I just felt smaller after what happened inside it. I didn't report the incident. I didn't mention the exhale. I didn't mention how, later that night, long after I'd returned to my cabin, my clothes still felt cold from the inside. Instead, I convinced myself I was losing perspective. That stress was warping experience. That isolation was creeping into my judgment. But the forest wasn't done with me, not even close. Months later, a local logger named Tomas approached me at the ranger station. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with hands like tree roots and a voice worn thin by cigarettes and wind. He'd worked these woods 30 years, long enough to earn the kind of respect that didn't need to be spoken. He sat down across from me, closed the office door, and said he had something to tell me, something he'd never shared with anyone official. He leaned forward, his eyes drifting toward the tree line outside the window. "Those woods make sounds you can live with," he said. "Owls, wind, coyotes, even the screams you mistake for animals. But there's one sound you don't live through, one sound that doesn't belong to this world or the next." He paused for a long time. "It's breathing. Not loud, not heavy, but wrong. Wrong in a way your bones understand before your mind catches up." A chill crawled up my neck. He didn't know about the cave. He shouldn't have known anything. But the way he described it was exactly what I'd felt, like air shifting around something too large to be unseen. He told me he heard that breath once while working alone deep in the boundary's northern sector. He'd been cutting deadfall when the forest went quiet in a way that felt staged, manufactured, as if something told everything else to stop moving. Moments later, he felt warmth on the back of his ear. "Warmth," he said, "in 20-degree weather," like someone leaned in to whisper. He dropped his tools and ran. He never returned to that section of forest again. He looked at me then, eyes hard. "Something's moving out there, Ranger, and it watches the ones who don't run." I wanted to dismiss him. I wanted to cling to logic, but his story echoed mine too closely. Over time, more people came forward, quietly, cautiously, as if the forest itself would hear them. A fisherman who found his camp stove still warm after leaving it untouched for hours. A woman who swore she felt a hand on her shoulder while hiking alone, only to turn and see nothing but stillness. A teenager who heard someone calling his name from the timberline long after his father had gone to sleep. These stories didn't come all at once. They dripped in, each one forming cracks in the version of reality I'd spent years defending. Eventually, I couldn't pretend anymore. There was something in these woods, something that didn't just live here, it remembered here. Something old enough to be patient and clever enough to stay hidden. But denial dies hard. And mine didn't collapse until the night of the supply incident. I'd been assigned to deliver fresh lanterns and first aid kits to Firewatch Cabin 2. It was late. A long day, paperwork, overdue reports, and by the time I started the hike, dusk was already pooling in the valleys. Cabin 2 sits on a rise overlooking a stretch of pines known for echoing strangely. Voices bounce through that area in ways even the best acoustic experts can't fully explain. I've heard my own footsteps echo back at me as if someone else was walking just behind. On the trail up, the forest grew unnervingly still, not the peaceful kind, the expectant kind, the kind that feels like a held breath. Halfway there, I smelled it again, that metallic scent from the hunter's disappearance. Thick, heavy. It drifted on the breeze like a warning. I tightened my grip on the gear bag, kept walking. When I reached the cabin, the lock felt warm. Unnaturally warm. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room. Everything looked normal. Supplies stacked neatly, firewood dry, no broken windows, no tracks, but my skin prickled as I crossed the room. Something wasn't right. I placed the new lanterns on the shelf, and that's when I felt it, a weight behind me. Not touching, hovering, like a presence leaning too close. Cold rolled across my back, my breath caught, and then knock. Not on the door, on the inside wall, right beside me. 3 slow knocks, spaced just like the ones from Cabin 3 years ago. My hand drifted to my holster, not to draw my weapon, but to ground myself, to remind myself I was still real. The room darkened slightly, as if a shadow had passed over the windows. The lanterns flickered. The air tightened. I didn't turn. I didn't speak. I grabbed my pack, stepped outside, and began the long walk back down the ridge. The forest was silent. Too silent. Even my footsteps felt muffled, like the world was listening. Halfway down the trail, branches cracked behind me. Not the scatter of a deer, not the scramble of a bear. One crack, then another, then breathing. Deep, slow, perfectly synchronized with my own. I didn't look back. I walked, controlled, steady, every instinct screaming. Something was following me, matching me, mirroring me. And when the trail finally opened into the lower valley, the breathing stopped, the smell faded, the branches stilled. I made it back to the station just past midnight and didn't sleep until dawn. That night was the first time I understood something fundamental. Whatever lives in the boundary doesn't just observe, it studies, it waits, and it chooses certain people to follow. And I was no longer just a ranger in its territory. I was becoming part of its story. Once you realize something is following you, not an animal, not a person, but something that seems to move between breath and shadow, you stop thinking of yourself as a protector of the forest. You start wondering if the forest ever needed protecting at all, and more importantly, whether it ever wanted you here. For weeks after that night on the ridge, I tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy. Daylight made things easier. Rationality feels stronger under the sun. I told myself the knocks were in my head, that the breathing was stress, that the boundary ridge was amplifying sound the way it often does. But the forest had shifted its attention toward me, and once it sets its gaze, it doesn't look away quickly. Small things started happening. Little distortions in the daily rhythm I'd come to rely on. One morning, I woke to the smell of wet fur inside my cabin, thick and pungent, even though the door was locked from the inside. Another time, I found pine needles scattered across my kitchen table, even though no windows had been opened in days. I heard footsteps on my cabin's porch at night, slow, deliberate steps that didn't match animals, because no animal pauses that long between movements. I'd sit in the dark, spine rigid, ears straining. The boards would creak under the weight of something heavy enough to bow them inward. Then silence. Silence so complete you could hear the shift of your own heartbeat. I didn't look through the window. I refused to. Some lines you don't cross unless you want to invite something closer. But the worst shift came from within me. Something inside my mind started to unravel. The part of myself that insisted on logic and order. The part that believed the world stayed within the boundaries I'd drawn for it. I started doubting my own senses, my memories, even my instincts. Fear does that. It rewires you quietly, like roots growing beneath a foundation. Around that time, I had to guide 2 missing hikers back to the main camp. They'd wandered off a poorly marked trail near the Southern Creek and gotten disoriented. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and trembling, not from the cold, but from something else, something they refused to talk about. As we walked, the older hiker glanced over his shoulder every few minutes, eyes wide and unfocused. When I asked what he'd seen, he swallowed hard and said, "It was tall." His partner shook his head sharply, as if warning him to stay quiet, but fear makes people selfish, and the older one needed to speak. "It walked upright," he whispered. And when it paused, the trees stopped moving. Those words hit me harder than they should have. I could hear the truth in them, raw, instinctive truth from someone who had no reason to invent a nightmare. As we neared the main trail, the younger hiker finally broke his silence. He said they'd heard something walking parallel to them for nearly an hour. Not fast, not hiding, just keeping pace. Each time one of them stumbled, the thing stopped, as if waiting. That was when the older hiker added something I still think about late at night. He said the thing had paused near a fallen tree and exhaled loudly enough to frost the air, and that when they ran, it didn't chase. It simply walked behind them, matching their panic with patience. They wouldn't spend another night anywhere near the boundary after that. They begged me to escort them out before dusk, and as I watched them leave, a thought gnawed at me. The forest doesn't scare everyone equally. It chooses, and maybe it had been choosing me for a long time. A few evenings later, after a long shift clearing a trail, I returned to my cabin to find something strange. My front door was locked, just the way I'd left it. The windows were latched. But in the dead center of my kitchen table sat a single pine cone covered in a substance that looked like dried mud mixed with hair. I went still, completely still. I hadn't brought it in. No one had been inside. And pine cones don't walk. I reached out slowly and touched it with the tip of one finger. It was warm, not from sunlight. It was late evening, but warm like someone had held it in their hand minutes before I walked in. I backed away, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The air was still, too still. No wind, no insects, not even distant owls. It felt like the forest was holding its breath again. That night, sleep refused to touch me. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything that would tell me I wasn't imagining this descent. Hours passed like slow drips from a broken faucet, and just when I finally felt my body relax, I heard it. Knocking. 3 knocks, this time not on the door. Not on the walls, on the window right beside my bed. I didn't move, my breath lodged somewhere between lungs and throat. The knocks came again. Same rhythm, same patience, as though whoever, or whatever, stood outside had all the time in the world. I waited until dawn before opening the curtains. There were no footprints, but the glass was fogged from the outside. I didn't call headquarters, not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't trust myself. I needed proof, something tangible. So the next night, I set a trap, not a physical one, but a test. I placed freshly fallen snow from the ridge in a shallow pan outside my door, smoothed flat like a blank canvas. Anything that stepped near the cabin would leave a mark. I set it down, went inside, locked everything, and waited. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, somewhere near 2 a.m., I heard branches shift, not crack. Shift. Slow, like something brushing against them intentionally. Then the softest sound, a dragged breath. Not quite human. Not quite animal, something in between. I held my breath, listened. Something moved toward the door. A heavy, controlled step, then another. The boards on the porch dipped. The air grew colder. My skin prickled, then silence. The kind of silence you can feel through bone. It lasted minutes, maybe more. Eventually, I heard slow movement retreating back into the trees, one step at a time. At dawn, I opened the door. The snow in the pan was untouched. But the snow around it, completely untouched except for one place, held a single print. Just one. As if the creature had lowered its foot once, leaned close, then stepped back without disturbing anything else. The print was enormous, deep, and shaped just like the ones I'd found years earlier on Boundary Ridge. That was the moment I knew this wasn't random. This wasn't stress. This wasn't imagination. It had returned. It had found me again. And it wasn't content staying in the shadows anymore. In the days that followed, I felt its presence everywhere. Not constantly, not aggressively, but consistently, like a thread tied to the corner of my mind, tugged gently whenever I wandered too far from awareness. Locals started to notice something in me too, a certain edge, a certain quietness. And one elder woman, someone who'd lived in these woods longer than most of us, pulled me aside near the general store one afternoon. She looked at me with eyes that held more years than her face showed. "You're marked," she said softly. "Not cursed. Marked. The boundary sees you now." I asked her what that meant. She shook her head. "Whatever breathes in those trees doesn't want your fear. It wants your attention." Her words clung to me for days. Attention, not fear. Something was trying to be known. But known for what? Known as what? The answer came sooner than I expected. And it came from a place the forest had been leading me toward since the beginning. The caves. The same caves locals forbid their children from approaching, the same caves where I'd felt it breathing behind me, the same caves that seemed to swallow warmth, sanity, and logic with the same hunger. That was where everything changed, because the forest wasn't done with me. It was only guiding me deeper. The caves had waited long enough. I don't know when I accepted that truth. Maybe the moment I saw that single footprint outside my cabin. Maybe the moment the elder woman called me marked. Maybe it was earlier, years earlier, back when I first stepped into those narrow openings in the ridge and felt the darkness watching me with a patience I didn't yet understand. Whatever the reason, the pull became undeniable. The boundary wasn't just a place anymore. It felt like an intention, a direction, a slow guidance toward something I had spent my entire career avoiding. So the next morning, before the sun fully climbed over the tree line, I packed light gear, flashlight, emergency rations, a rope line, and a radio, and headed toward the southern cliffs with a resolve I didn't entirely trust. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't leave a note. I didn't want anyone to try to stop me, because some part of me knew this was not a search mission. This was a confrontation, or maybe it was an invitation. The hike started quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. The forest wasn't simply still, it was listening. I could feel the observation on my skin, in the shift of air brushing against the side of my face, in the way each footstep seemed too loud. The pines didn't sway, the underbrush didn't twitch, the forest didn't breathe. It waited. By the time I reached the cave system, sweat was trickling down my spine, even though the morning air was crisp. The entrance yawned before me. Same jagged mouth, same cold breath drifting outward, same uneasy gravity drawing the living toward the unknown. My flashlight beam cut a narrow path into the dark, but the deeper spaces swallowed the light until everything looked like a throat. I stepped inside. The transition was instant. Warm breath fogged. The air froze around me in a way that didn't align with temperature. It felt emotional, deliberate, like stepping into grief. The floor crunched beneath my boots. The walls echoed faintly with the smallest sounds. And then, deeper in, I heard it. Breathing. Not mine, not human. Slow, controlled inhales, long, patient exhales. Not aggressive, not hiding, just present, waiting. I stood still, muscles taut, listening. The breath wasn't moving. It was holding position somewhere beyond the first bend, not advancing, not retreating, almost encouraging me forward. Against every rational instinct I possessed, I moved deeper. My flashlight beam wavered as the walls narrowed. The stone felt damp and strangely warm under my fingertips. I followed the sound until the passage opened into a wider chamber, a hollow dome of rock streaked with mineral lines like old scars. And there, at the far end of the chamber, stood the impossible. A shape, tall, motionless, silhouetted by nothing but darkness. It wasn't fully visible, just an outline as if carved from the absence of light, shoulders too wide, limbs too long, head slightly inclined, like it was studying me with a quiet intelligence. My heartbeat stuttered. I didn't reach for my weapon. Something deeper, older, told me that aggression was meaningless here. This wasn't prey, this wasn't predator in the way we understand it. This was something else, something that inhabited intention as much as space. The breathing deepened. And then something happened I still struggle to describe because it wasn't a sound or movement. It was recognition. Not mine. It recognized me. Not as a threat, not as prey, but as someone it had been watching long enough to understand. A wave of warmth rolled through the chamber, tinged with that metallic scent from the hunter's disappearance. The air tightened as though the shape inhaled deeply, pulling the atmosphere into its chest. My vision blurred around the edges, and for a moment I felt disoriented, like the ground had tilted or the walls had shifted. Then it exhaled. The breath washed over me with a force that wasn't physical but psychological. Memories flickered. My first night as a ranger, the missing hunter's pack, the fog that followed the brothers, the knocking on cabin walls, the pine cone on my table. Each image felt tethered to a thread stretching back to this moment, as if everything that had happened was part of a path I hadn't known I was walking. The shape's head tilted slightly, not threatening, acknowledging. And in that small gesture, something in me cracked. A truth, not spoken, not clearly defined, slid into place. I had not been followed. I had been led. The breathing changed rhythm, becoming softer, like it had shifted focus from observing to considering. Then, slowly, achingly slowly, the shape lifted one arm. Its hand, large, impossible, more akin to the prints I'd seen, extended outward, not reaching for me, pointing, toward a narrow passage on the left side of the chamber. A passage I had never noticed before, one hidden by angles and darkness. The gesture lingered, a direction, a request, a command. I swallowed hard and shook my head instinctively. The shape didn't move, didn't react, just breathed. I tried to speak, but my voice collapsed in my throat. Instead, a small, broken whisper emerged. "What do you want?" The shape inhaled deeply. The walls trembled, not violently, subtly, like a shudder passing through stone. Then, for the first time, I heard something other than breathing. A voice. Not words, not language. Just a resonance, low, ancient, vibrating through the air like a memory. It wasn't sound, it was impression. Like the echo of a scream buried centuries ago. Like the grief Marcy had spoken of when she said the pines hold on to every tragedy. The voice wasn't angry or malicious. It was mournful. It pressed against my chest until my breath hitched. I stepped backward, overwhelmed. The shape's arm lowered. For a moment, the chamber dimmed further, as though the creature had drawn the darkness closer around itself. The breathing steadied, no longer urging, no longer pointing, just watching. I turned toward the passage it had indicated. The narrow gap sloped downward, disappearing into a tunnel veined with faint glimmers of mineral light. I could feel air drifting from that direction, cold, damp, and carrying a scent I recognized too well. Iron, earth, decay. I didn't want to go in there, but something inside me, a mix of dread and duty, whispered that the passage held the truth the forest had been trying to show me for years. I stepped forward. Just once. The breathing in the chamber changed. A sharp inhale as if in anticipation. I froze. Then I stepped again. The shape didn't follow. It simply watched. As I reached the threshold of the passage, the air changed. It felt thicker, older, like I was crossing into a space untouched by daylight or human presence for longer than the forest had existed above it. Before entering, I turned back one last time. The shape remained perfectly still, head inclined, as if silently urging me onward. I raised my flashlight and stepped into the passage. The moment I entered, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged instantly. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowering until I had to duck. The tunnel curved sharply, then dipped downward. Each step echoed in a way that didn't just bounce back. It followed me, as though footsteps behind me were joining mine a fraction of a second late. Deeper, colder, darker. Then I reached a flat ledge overlooking a small cavern. The beam of my flashlight fell upon something that made my skin crawl and my lungs freeze. A pile. Not of bones, not of belongings, but of shoes. Boots, hiking shoes, torn sneakers. Some old, some new, some half buried in sediment. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered like leaves caught in the current of time. I recognized one pair instantly. The hunter's boots, the ones I never found. My breath trembled out of me. The metallic scent thickened, and as I shone the light across the cavern, something else came into view. Scratches on the far wall. Deep grooves, not from claws, from hands. I staggered backward, gripping the wall to steady myself. Something had been down here. Many somethings. For a very long time, a sound rose behind me. Breathing, distant but unmistakable. Not from the chamber I'd left, from farther inside the cave. Deeper, older. And this time it wasn't one breath. It was many. Layered, rasping, hungry. I turned and ran. I ran without thinking, only moving, only reacting, only obeying the instincts so deeply wired into the human body that it predates language. The tunnel scraped my shoulders as I pushed through, its narrow walls funneling me back toward the chamber like the throat of the earth trying to reclaim me. My breath came in sharp bursts, echoing up and down the stone passage until it blended with the chorus of breaths behind me. Not one breath, not one creature. Several. Each exhale staggered slightly, creating a layered rhythm that didn't match mine. Some were deep, some rasped, some fluttered like lungs that hadn't breathed in a long time. The sounds didn't chase me, they accompanied me, as though the things in that deeper cavern were rising, awakening, acknowledging a disturbance that my presence had triggered. My shoulders slammed into the cave wall as I rounded the bend. Pain shot down my arm, but I kept moving. When I reached the wider chamber, the shape was still there, still tall, still watching. But the breathing behind me grew louder, more crowded, more alive, and when the shape slowly turned its head, not toward me, but toward the passage I had just fled, I understood something that chilled me deeper than any cave air ever could. It wasn't guarding the cave from me. It was guarding me from the cave. The chamber walls pulsed with the sound of approaching breath. The shape took one step forward, not toward the passage, not toward me, but toward the center of the room, as if positioning itself between the deeper tunnels and the exit. A low resonance filled the space, a vibration that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a voice. It was warning, a command, a line being drawn. The layered breaths behind me faltered, paused, waited. The shape stood like a sentinel, featureless and vast, holding back whatever lurked in those deeper caverns with nothing but presence. And then, with a slow tilt of its head, it looked back at me, not threatening, not pleading, but insistent. Go. Without hesitation, I did. I scrambled across the chamber, my flashlight beam jerking wildly as I reached the tunnel leading back to daylight. Behind me, the breathing from the deeper cavern swelled, shaking dust from the ceiling. Something huge shifted in the darkness. Something scraped stone. Something answered the sentinel's presence with a sound that vibrated through my teeth. I didn't look back. Not then. Not ever. I barreled out of the cave, stumbling into the sun-drenched pines with a gasp of air so sharp it nearly knocked me off my feet. My legs shook. My hands shook. My bones shook. But I kept running until the cave was just a wound in the mountainside behind me. The forest met me with silence, but it wasn't the hollow quiet I'd felt before. This silence felt lifted, like the trees were releasing a breath they'd been holding for years. I slowed only when the path widened. My lungs burned. My throat ached with the taste of rust and stone. But something inside me had settled. The smallest thread of understanding that made everything both clearer and more terrifying. Whatever stood in that chamber wasn't my enemy. It wasn't a beast. It wasn't a cryptid. It wasn't a legend. It was something older than the stories, older than the pines, older than the grief etched into these woods. And it wasn't the only one. By the time I returned to the ranger station, dusk was creeping across the valley, turning the sky the bruised color that always reminded me of transition. Day to night, safe to unsafe, known to unknown. My reflection in the station window didn't look like mine. Something in my eyes was different. Something had shifted behind them, like a door left ajar. I showered, changed, sat at the kitchen table, and waited for fear to hit me in full. It didn't. What hit me instead was clarity. A realization that made my breath pause, the footprints that appeared after storms, the knocks on cabin walls, the breathing behind me, the hunter who vanished, the brothers in the fog, the pine cone left on my table, the cold in the cave, the warmth at the door, the presence outside my cabin. They weren't separate events, they weren't random, they weren't hauntings, they were communication, a language as old as earth and shadow, a language spoken in breath, in temperature, in echo, and scent, and patience, a language the pines themselves were part of. These forests aren't empty. They're inhabited, guarded, mourned, protected, not just by life, but by memory. And whatever lived beneath those caves didn't want the living wandering too deep into the grave of something ancient. The sentinel, the tall one, hadn't led me into danger. It had led me to the border of truth, and it had stopped me from crossing. That night, long after darkness settled over the boundary, I heard a single knock on my cabin door. One knock, soft, measured, not demanding entry, acknowledging presence. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Instead, I stood beside the door in the darkness, feeling the presence on the other side. Not threatening, not hunting, just there, like a shadow leaning against the wood. After a moment, a deep exhale brushed the bottom of the door, warm, heavy, familiar. Then silence. When I stepped outside at dawn, there were no prints, but the air felt different, balanced, as if the forest had readjusted itself around a truth that no longer needed to hide. I walked into the pines, letting the morning settle around me. Light filtered through the branches in pale ribbons, dust motes drifting through them like fragments of forgotten memories. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the scent of earth and resin. For the first time in years, the fear didn't take hold. Not because the forest was safe, but because I finally understood what fear had been trying to teach me. The unknown isn't always a threat. Sometimes it's a boundary. Sometimes it's a warning. Sometimes it's a guardian. And sometimes it's a mirror showing you exactly how fragile your reason becomes when you step into darkness without listening first. I've walked these woods for decades, but only now am I beginning to understand them. The locals were right. The pines remember everything. They remember what was lost. They remember what was buried. They remember what waits beneath, hungering to rise again. But they also remember who respects them, who listens, who doesn't turn away. And maybe that's why the sentinel still watches me, not as prey, not as an intruder, but as someone who finally hears the forest's language, even if I don't yet know how to speak it back. I don't know what else lives beneath those caves, or why the air there trembles with centuries of buried breath. I don't know why those deeper chambers are filled with the remnants of people who never returned. I don't know what grief so powerful seeped into the ground that the pines became living monuments. But I do know this. Some spirits belong to the living, some belong to the dead, and some belong to the space in between. The space where echo becomes memory, and memory becomes warning, and warning becomes protection. The boundary is all three. I still hear breathing sometimes in the trees outside my cabin, but it no longer freezes me. It no longer steals sleep. It no longer pushes me toward panic. Now when I hear it, I feel something else. Recognition, resonance, a reminder of what lies beneath the forest floor and what stands guard above it. A reminder that the pines whisper not to frighten, but to remember. And sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I whisper back. Not words, just a breath. A boundary respected, a truth understood, a forest answered, and somewhere in the distance the sentinel exhales in return. The night the pines began whispering my name was the night I stopped pretending the forest was only made of trees. My voice is steady now when I tell this story, but back then, even breathing felt like a decision I had to make. That night carved itself into my memory the way lightning burns a scar into a mountainside. My name is not important, not really. But I will tell you this, I am 36 years old, and I've spent more than half my life walking the same ridge lines, patrolling the same valley floors, and listening to the same winds carry the same warnings through a stretch of pine forest locals here call the Listening Woods. It's not a name printed on any map or trailhead sign. It's a name spoken on porches, muttered in gas stations, or whispered by hunters who return with less confidence than when they left. I grew up only an hour from this forest, which maybe explains why I once believed its stories were just stories. I knew the locals spoke about strange disappearances, solo hikers who stepped off trail and never returned, hunters who left behind full packs as if something lifted them out of their own boots, campers who radioed for help but vanished before search teams arrived. I heard the rumors, the same ones tourists heard. Strange lights near the old fire tower, heavy bipedal footsteps moving between tents, shadows pacing the tree line right after sunset. Folks here like to talk. That alone didn't make the woods evil. But the way they talked, that was different. You could hear it in the pauses, the things they didn't say, the words they replaced with glances toward the darkest part of the tree line. Even as a kid, that silence pressed against me harder than any story could. The first time I told my family I wanted to become a forest ranger in these woods, my mother just shook her head. My father didn't say anything at all. He just set down his fork, leaned back, and looked at me the same way a man looks at a house's foundation after hearing it groan in a storm. "You'll learn," he finally said, "one way or another." For a long time, I didn't understand what he meant. I joined the service young, full of confidence and that reckless belief that experience protects you. I trained hard, moved up fast, and landed a position patrolling one of the most remote districts. Thick pine, old mining caves, 2 aging cabins used for shelter, and enough radio dead zones to make you feel like the earth itself didn't want your voice traveling through it. But I felt proud, ready, useful. It took years before I realized the forest was studying me as closely as I was studying it. Some places out here feel alive in ways nobody wants to admit. You step onto certain trails and the air feels heavier. Step into certain meadows and every sound, every bird call, every snapping twig hits your ears sharper than it should. I always assumed it was instinct. The survival part of the brain honed by generations of ancestors who outran predators or froze just in time. But instincts don't explain everything. Not what I'm about to tell you. The first strange situation I encountered happened in late September. Early fall here is unpredictable. Cold at dawn, warm by afternoon, and the kind of crisp wind at night that carries smells from miles away. I was on a 3-day solo patrol, checking campsites and making sure a storm that passed through hadn't blocked any of the emergency routes. My pack felt heavier than usual, though I blamed it on my own exhaustion. Truth is, I hadn't been sleeping well. I kept waking up to the same dream, a dripping sound echoing through a dark cave I didn't recognize. I told myself it was stress. Everyone dreams of caves eventually. You study enough maps, you start dreaming in contour lines. By the second afternoon, a light fog began rolling through the valley. Nothing dangerous. But fog in these woods doesn't move like regular fog. It doesn't drift, it creeps, taking its time curling around each pine as if deciding which ones deserve to be seen and which ones should remain hidden. It was during that walk, hiking a narrow stretch between two ridges, that I noticed something strange. The air smelled wrong. Most people don't think of pine forests as having a strong smell, but they do. Dry resin, old bark, dust kicked up by deer, the faint sweetness of sap. That day, though, something sour traced the wind. Not rot, not garbage. Something else. A wet, old scent I'd never smelled before, but immediately disliked. The kind of smell that makes your throat close before you even realize you've stopped breathing. I scanned the woods, didn't see anything. The fog thickened but stayed low, as if it didn't want to rise above knee level. I kept walking, slower now, hand near my radio, even though I knew it wouldn't pick up much in that section. About 10 minutes later, I heard something I still struggle to describe. A knock. Not a woodpecker's rhythm, not a falling pine cone, not the crack of a branch under an elk's weight. It was deliberate. 3 slow knocks, like knuckles against wood. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I heard it in my ears. I stood completely still, even held my breath, trying to figure out where the sound came from. At that moment, I knew 2 things. The sound was close, and I was being watched. The fog curved around my boots. The air smelled even more sour, like lake water trapped too long underground. I tried to pinpoint the direction, but the knocking echoed strangely, bouncing off trees in a way that didn't make sense. A breeze swept through, and with it came something colder, colder than the air should have been. Then I heard the knock again. 3 taps. Slower this time. Closer. There's a moment when your instincts and your training stop being separate things. When they merge into one cold, clear command, do not move, do not speak, listen. So I listened. A branch or something heavier shifted behind me. I turned slowly, trying not to crunch the pine needles under my boots. Saw nothing, just fog, just trees, just silence. And then the whisper came. Soft, breathy, carried on a wind that moved only the needles above me. My name, not shouted, not spoken, whispered. I don't care who you are or how brave you think you might be. Nothing prepares you for hearing your name spoken by something you cannot see. The hairs on my arms rose. My hands went numb. I felt myself shrinking inside my own chest, something I hadn't felt since childhood. But I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to swallow the panic climbing my throat. I whispered out loud, barely audible even to myself, "No. No. You're just tired. You're just hearing things. It's the fog playing tricks with the sound." I repeated that to myself until my hands stopped shaking. I waited a full minute before taking another step. The knock didn't return. The whisper didn't return. The sour smell faded, but the fear didn't. It sunk deeper, curling with an intelligence I didn't want to acknowledge. I left that valley faster than I'll ever admit. I didn't run. I maintained the pace of a ranger who looks in control. But every step felt like stepping away from something that followed just out of sight. What I didn't know then was that this first encounter was just the beginning, the easy beginning. The forest was testing me, pressing on the soft edges of my confidence, peeling back layers I didn't realize were fragile. The woods weren't simply alive, they were aware, and they weren't done with me. I didn't report the knocking or the whisper to the district office. I told myself it wasn't worth putting into the log. Strange sounds happen in the woods all the time, echoes bouncing off granite, animals imitating noises you swear aren't in their nature. And even if I did write it down, what would it say about me? That I was tired? Hearing things? Losing my edge? The forest has a way of exposing your pride. It tests it the way storms test old fire towers, each new gust pushing against what you assume is unshakable. Mine was beginning to sway, and I didn't want anyone to notice. Still, that night back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. Something the forest had shown me, but I refused to understand. I barely slept. Every time the wind moved through the pines, it carried a texture I didn't trust, like a hum with a voice buried in it. When dawn broke, I packed up quickly and made the long hike back to the station. I told myself a couple days at home would clear my head, and for a while it did. But the locals noticed something in me that I hadn't admitted yet. When I walked into the general store the next morning, old man Russell, who'd lived here long enough to see 3 generations of rangers come and go, stared at me with that narrow-eyed look only people who've survived the woods know how to give. "You saw something," he muttered as I passed. I stopped. I didn't say a word. "You didn't need to." He wiped down the counter with a slow, methodical motion. The forest marks you when it wants to. Some folks get marked lighter than others. Some get marked so deep it changes their walk. I didn't respond. Didn't even know how. "You ought to stay away from that valley," he added without looking at me. Fog settles wrong there. Sound goes sideways. I wanted to ask him what he meant by sideways, but the look he gave me, sharp, warning, familiar in a way I didn't yet understand, kept the question trapped in my throat. I picked up my supplies, paid, and left. But his words followed me out the door the way the whisper had followed me through the fog. Stay away from that valley. I tried. A few weeks passed without incident, and I convinced myself that my mind had filled in the gaps. I blamed exhaustion, stress, the dream about the dripping cave. But denial is a fragile shield. It cracks the moment you lean on it too hard. And one cold morning in early October, it shattered. That day started normal. Cold wind, frost along the edges of the ranger yard, 2 volunteers waiting to be assigned clearing work near Creek Hollow. I stayed behind to review incident reports. Nothing out of the ordinary. A missing dog, a hiker who swore they heard chanting near Lost Knoll, which happens more often than you'd think, and a camper reporting heavy footsteps around their tent before dawn. Then the radio static burst. Not a message, not interference. Static, sharp, violent, like someone dragging metal along the inside of the speaker. I grabbed the receiver. Base to all units, I'm hearing interference. Anyone else getting that? No answer. The static died as suddenly as it started, replaced by a hollow quiet that felt heavier than silence had any right to be. I set the radio down. Then it spoke again. Not static this time, knocking. 3 slow knocks. I stared at the console, blood draining from my face. The knocks weren't coming from outside. They weren't even coming from the door. They were coming from the radio itself. Knock, knock, knock. I reached for the receiver again, but before I could speak, the radio emitted a low sound, something between a breath and a growl. A vibration rattled the metal casing, and then I smelled it, that same sour, wet scent from the valley. It seeped through the room, curling through the air like something alive. I staggered backward, chair legs scraping across the floor. That's when the whisper came through the radio. My name. Soft, drawn out, almost curious. I slammed my hand onto the power switch. The radio died instantly. My heart was shaking so hard I worried it might break free from my ribs. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, gulping in cold air as if I'd been drowning. The yard was empty. The world was normal. The frost glittered. A raven croaked from the roof of the shed. But something was wrong with me now. Deeply, undeniably wrong. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. By the time I caught my breath, I realized I was gripping my truck keys so hard my knuckles had gone white. I drove out of the station without telling anyone, turning onto the logging road that wound toward the North Ridge. I didn't have a plan. Didn't even know why I was driving there. But some part of me felt pulled, dragged even, toward the tree line. Not the valley. Thank God, not the valley. Just the ridge. When the road narrowed, I parked and stepped out. A cold wind cut across the ridge, carrying brittle pine scent. I walked slowly, scanning the forest for movement. The deeper I went, the more the world tightened. Even the crunch of needles under my boots sounded muted, as if the forest was swallowing the noise. Half a mile in, I saw it. A footprint. Large. Too large. Human-shaped but wrong. The pad was deeper than the edges, as if whatever stepped wasn't balanced quite like a person. And the stride was enormous. Twice mine. I knelt beside it, studying the shape. No claw marks, no boot tread. Just a bare, heavy impression pressed deep into the earth. Locals had whispered about something like this for years. The tall shape they'd seen near the river, the shadow pacing the tree line, the scream that didn't sound like an animal or a man. They never used the word directly, but I'd heard it enough times in hushed tones to understand what they meant. Yeti. Sasquatch. Wildman. Most rangers roll their eyes when those stories come up. I used to be one of them. Not anymore. The wind shifted. That sour smell touched the air again, faint this time, but unmistakable. I stood up slowly. Something moved behind the trees. A shape. Tall. Heavier than any elk. Its outline shifting between the trunks. I didn't reach for my gun. I didn't want to make it worse. Instead, I stepped back. One slow step, then another. The forest pressed around me, leaning closer with every heartbeat. The shape didn't move toward me. It simply watched. The same way a storm watches the horizon before deciding where to break. And then something happened that nearly dropped me to my knees. It inhaled. A long, slow breath. Not just through the forest, through me. I felt the pull inside my chest, like the air around my ribs shifted, like something tasted the fear in my lungs. The whisper from the valley returned, not from behind me, not ahead of me, but everywhere at once. My name. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. My hands shook uncontrollably. I forced myself to keep moving until I reached the truck. I climbed in, slammed the door, locked it, and sat there trembling so violently I couldn't put the key into the ignition. The forest was no longer testing me. It was studying me, learning me. And it wanted something I didn't understand. Not yet. But I would, because that was only the second story. And the woods never stop at 2. I drove until the trees thinned, until the road widened, until the weight on my chest loosened enough for me to breathe like a human being again. But even then, even miles from that footprint, I kept checking the rearview mirror. My eyes flicked there every few seconds, hunting for a shape too tall for the roadside pines, too dark for early morning light. My heartbeat didn't settle until I reached town. But the relief didn't last. Because once you've been watched, truly watched, you never stop thinking about it. You carry that awareness like a second shadow. I tried to tell myself the footprint belonged to a bear stepping oddly or a hunter wearing something unusual, but those weren't lies I could swallow anymore. I'd felt the breath, heard my name in a voice that didn't come from human lungs, and there was something else, something deeper I didn't admit to anyone. When that thing inhaled, it felt like it was learning me, mapping me, as if my fear gave it direction. I took a few days off duty after that, told my supervisor I had a fever. That wasn't true, but it wasn't exactly false either. Something was wrong with me, something feverish in the mind, not the body. My dreams were the worst part. In them, I stood at the mouth of a dark cave I didn't recognize, the kind of cave where light goes in but never comes out. Each dream started with the same sound, dripping water echoing off stone walls, and each time I felt compelled to step inside, even as every instinct screamed at me not to. But what unsettled me most was this. In each dream, the cave was breathing, slowly, heavily, as if something enormous slept deep inside it. The dreams grew more vivid each night. By the fourth night, I woke up with my shirt stuck to my back from sweat. The image of the cave mouth still hovered behind my eyes, pulsing like a wound. I couldn't stay home anymore. Silence made my thoughts louder. The empty walls made them echo. So I went back to the station. When I walked in, two of the younger rangers, just kids in their 20s, were discussing a call they'd responded to the night before. They lowered their voices when they saw me, but I'd already heard the important part. Said something was knocking on the door of their cabin, but no one was out there. I stepped toward them. "Which cabin?" They stiffened. "North Shelter," one of them said. "Family from out of state. They were the only ones out there." My stomach tightened. The North Shelter wasn't far from the ridge where I'd seen the footprint. "What kind of knocking?" I asked. The younger one shrugged. "They said it sounded like someone knocking to be let in." "3 knocks," the other ranger added, rubbing his arms. "Not fast, slow, like a person." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Did they see anything?" "No," he said, "but they said they heard something breathing outside the wall." Breathing, always the breathing. I walked past them without another word and locked myself in the map room. The forest lay spread before me in green and brown splotches as if painted there by someone who didn't understand how alive it truly was. I traced the ridgelines with my fingers. The valley, the North Shelter, the old mining district, that dream cave. It formed a route, unintentional but undeniable. Something was moving through these woods, and I was standing in its path. By noon, I gathered my gear and headed back out. Some part of me wanted answers, even if every rational part of my brain begged me to turn around. But you don't survive long as a ranger by ignoring your instincts, and mine were pointing me in a direction I didn't like. I didn't go to the valley. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face that place again. Instead, I hiked toward the northern shelters to inspect the area myself. The wind was light, the sky cold and bright. Everything should have felt normal. It didn't. With each step, the forest felt more aware. Birds went quiet when I passed. The air held a tension that wrapped itself beneath my skin. Even the sunlight felt wrong, thin in a way I couldn't explain, almost brittle. The first shelter was empty when I arrived. Clean, quiet, too quiet. I checked the door. Solid. Checked the windows. No scratches. No signs of forced entry. Only when I walked around the back did I find something strange. In the dirt behind the cabin was a long drag mark, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ground, one long, unbroken trail that disappeared into the trees. No blood, no torn fabric. But whatever made it wasn't small. I crouched beside it. The smell found me before the fear did. Sour. Wet. The same underground scent from the valley. It hit so sharply I recoiled. My eyes watered. My stomach churned. I covered my mouth and nose with my sleeve, but it still clung to the back of my throat like a rotten memory. I followed the drag mark only a few feet into the woods before stopping. The pine needles scattered strangely, flattened, not crushed, as if something huge had hovered low enough to bend them without fully stepping down. My skin tightened. My breath turned shallow. That's when I heard it. A knocking. Not on wood, on stone. Somewhere deeper in the forest, something struck rock with the same slow rhythm I'd heard in the valley. The sound carried through the trees and into my bones. Knock, knock, knock. Each strike echoed longer than the last, as if the stone chamber it came from was massive, far larger than anything natural. I turned slowly. The woods behind me had shifted. I didn't see it happen, but I felt it. The trees leaned inward, as if listening, as if waiting. And then a breeze swept through, cold enough to burn my lungs. The knocking stopped, the woods exhaled, and from somewhere too close, a voice whispered, not my name this time, but a word I didn't recognize. A single syllable, drawn out like a warning or an invitation. It vibrated inside me, low and resonant, as if spoken from a place far beneath the forest floor. I backed away, step by step, until I reached the cabin's porch. My hands shook so badly I dropped my flashlight. It clattered against the wooden planks, and in that instant the forest responded, not with movement, not with light, but with silence. Absolute unnatural silence. Even the wind died. Even the pine needles stilled. The world held its breath. Something was watching me. Not from the trees this time, from below. A memory surfaced, the dream cave, the dripping, the breathing, the unseen weight shifting in the dark. My throat tightened. My vision pulsed. There was a cave out here. I didn't know where, but I knew this much. I had been dreaming of a real place, and whatever lived in it had been dreaming of me. I grabbed my fallen flashlight and retreated fast, heart pounding so loudly the sound felt like thunder between my ears. The sour scent faded as I put distance between myself and the drag marks. The silence slowly cracked into normal forest sounds again. Rustling branches, a distant jay calling out, the faint groan of old pines bending in the wind. But something had changed. The fear I felt wasn't sharp now. It wasn't the kind that makes you jump at every twig snap. It was deeper, heavier, like a stone lodged behind my ribs, a dread that didn't disappear with distance. The forest had given me another piece of something larger, a pattern, a message, a map of fear carved into dirt and dreams. And I was beginning to understand the truth that the locals had known all along. The woods weren't haunted by spirits. The woods were the spirit, ancient, patient, listening, and the caves beneath them were its lungs. I didn't want to accept it. Not then, not yet, but something was guiding me toward the truth. Not gently, not kindly, but deliberately, the way cold water forces a drowning man to open his eyes. The forest wasn't just alive, it was intentional, and I was no longer moving through it. It was moving around me. After leaving the North Shelter, I hiked back at a faster pace than I should have. My heartbeat felt mismatched with my steps, jumping ahead, then lagging behind. The forest seemed to narrow around the trail, thinning the sky above me until the world pressed close enough to touch my shoulders. Every breath tasted like sap and cold stone. I didn't realize I'd stopped until I found myself standing beneath a ridge I hadn't intended to visit. The path had forked somewhere, and I'd followed the wrong branch without noticing. Or maybe the forest had shifted around me, the way it sometimes did when fog distorted distances or when storms made familiar places foreign. But there was no fog now, no storm, only clarity so sharp it hurt my eyes. And the ridge, I knew this ridge, not from maps, not from patrols, from my dreams, the same jagged line of rock, the same dark opening in the earth, the same sense of something breathing beneath the surface. My skin prickled as a slow realization crawled up my spine. I wasn't lost. I'd been led. The cave mouth waited ahead of me, narrow, sloping downward, draped with long strands of moss that hung like wet hair. The air there was colder, unnaturally so. A draft curled out from inside, carrying that familiar scent. Wet stone, stagnant water, and something sour beneath it. I should have turned back. No ranger enters a cave alone. It's a simple rule, obvious, sensible, etched in the training manual like gospel. But rules feel small when the forest wants something from you. They crumble in your palm like dry leaves. Before I knew it, I was walking toward the entrance, boots slipping slightly on the damp ground. The deeper I went, the more the world changed. The sunlight dimmed behind me, swallowed quickly, too quickly. The cold hit harder, sinking past my jacket, past my ribs, until it settled in my bones. Inside, the cave walls curved like a throat, narrow at first, then widening as if leading to a stomach that lay deeper underground. The sound of dripping met my ears, the same dripping from my dreams. Each drop echoed with a hollow resonance that made my chest tighten. The cave wasn't deep yet, but the echoes traveled impossibly far, as though the chamber ahead were massive, too massive to exist under a ridge this small. I took out my flashlight and swept the beam across the walls. The light caught on something pale. Scratches. Hundreds of them. Not random scrapes, not the marks of animals. These were long, deliberate gouges in the stone, some at shoulder height, some higher, much higher. The spacing made no sense. Too wide for human hands, too uneven for machinery. I felt my throat dry as dust. I took another step. The beam of my flashlight trembled over deeper marks, wide claw-like arcs etched into the rock. Not claws, not tools, fingers. Human-shaped, but far longer, far stronger. My stomach knotted, my breath grew shallow, the dripping intensified, not faster, just louder, as if distance itself bent inside the cave. I tried to convince myself it was natural, acoustics, geology, underground water channels, but beneath the logic was something else. Instinct, cold and primal. Something was in the cave. Not living, not dead, something in between those words. Something that breathed without lungs and listened without ears. I swept the light deeper. That's when I saw footprints. Not mine. Not from boots. Bare prints. Large. Heavy. The same shape I'd found near the ridge. They led deeper. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the light. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, to run, to leave this place behind and pretend it didn't exist. But another part of me, the part that had walked these forests for years, that had sworn to protect them, that had been marked by them, kept me rooted. I stepped forward. The ground shifted slightly, and the echoes of my footsteps floated in strange directions, some ahead of me, some behind me, one impossibly above, as if someone else were walking the ceiling. I didn't look up. I kept moving. The tunnel narrowed again, tight enough that my shoulders brushed the damp stone. My flashlight flickered just once, but long enough for me to feel a pulse of air stroke the back of my neck. I froze. Very slowly, I turned around. The beam of light scanned the tunnel behind me, empty, silent, cold. But the air still moved. Not a breeze, not pressure. More like heat shifting off an animal. But there was no heat, only cold. I continued forward, breath trembling until the tunnel opened into a chamber so wide my light couldn't reach the far walls. The sound of dripping echoed everywhere, multiplying into a chorus of hollow taps. In the center of the chamber was a pool, black water, still as glass. I approached it carefully. My reflection floated on the surface, a pale face, wide eyes, fear written in every line. But something else moved beneath the reflection. A shadow. It drifted slowly like a long limb swaying underwater. My entire body locked in place. Another limb slid beneath the surface, and another. Dark, elongated shapes shifting gently, too large to belong to anything I knew. Then the water rose, just slightly, just enough, as if something enormous exhaled from below. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet stone. My heart slammed against my chest in painful bursts. I didn't wait to see more. My instincts finally tore through the fear holding me there, and I turned toward the tunnel, but the tunnel was darker than before. Much darker. The light didn't reach as far. The shadows swallowed the beam like a mouth closing. A pulse of cold rolled through the chamber, pushing against my back. I felt the air compress as if something massive shifted its weight beneath the water. I took one step and another. The cold followed. Then a knock. Not behind me. Not on the water. Inside the stone. 3 slow knocks. The chamber answered with a low groan. A deep vibration that moved through the rock, through my legs, through my spine, until my vision blurred. Then the whisper came, echoing from every direction, low, layered, distorted by the stone walls. My name. Spoken not by one voice, but many. Whispers overlapping in a mournful chorus that seeped into my bones. I staggered forward, breath burning my throat. My flashlight flickered again. The darkness of the tunnel deepened, as if something stood in the way, something tall enough to fill but invisible to the light. Another knock. Closer. The tunnel walls vibrated. The water behind me rippled. The whispers swelled, weaving into a single word, another one I didn't recognize, heavy and guttural, as if spoken from deep in the earth's throat. I didn't stay to decipher it. I ran. My boots slipped, skidded, caught on loose stones. The tunnel walls squeezed inward like the cave itself was tightening. The air thickened behind me. Something moved. Not footsteps, not breath. A pressure, a presence. The darkness followed so close I felt it tug at the back of my jacket. The tunnel's incline steepened. I pushed upward, lungs screaming. The cold rose behind me, rising like a tide hungry for heat. The whisper became a roar, still soft, still breathy, but massive in scale. It filled the passage, vibrating the stone, my bones, my teeth. I burst through the cave mouth into daylight so suddenly it blinded me. I fell to my knees, gasping, gripping the ground like it might disappear. Behind me, the cave exhaled one last time, long, low, mournful. Then the forest went silent. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I knew the truth now. The cave wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it had seen me. I stayed on my knees for what felt like minutes, maybe longer, the sunlight warming the cold that had sunk deep into my bones. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, and each inhale tasted like I'd been breathing stone dust. The forest around me rustled softly, as if pretending it hadn't witnessed what crawled beneath its roots. Eventually, my hands stopped shaking enough for me to stand. But even as I walked away from the cave, I knew something had changed. Not just in me, but in the woods. The forest felt watchful again. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply alert. Like it was waiting to see what I would do now that I'd seen its hidden veins. I forced myself to slow my breathing, forced myself to walk like a ranger, not a hunted animal. But my senses were frayed. Sound and silence felt equally dangerous. Every broken twig was a threat. Every bird call felt like a warning. Halfway down the ridge, I stopped. The sunlight touched the trees with a warm gold, but the warmth didn't reach inside me. My body still felt tethered to the cave, as if a thread of cold remained knotted around my spine. And the whispers, they lingered, not clearly, not audibly, more like echoes that had imprinted themselves behind my heartbeat. I knew I had to tell someone, my supervisor, another ranger, anyone. But what would I say? That a cave breathed? That something whispered my name? That the forest had dragged me there like a puppet on invisible strings? No one would believe it. Hell, I barely believed it myself. So I walked. Down the ridge, across the worn trail, through the thinning trees, back to the place where the forest felt more like forest and less like something ancient wearing the earth-like skin. When I finally reached the truck, I leaned against the door and exhaled shakily. But before I opened it, something caught my eye. A shape. Tall, still, half hidden between the trunks to my right. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned slowly. The shape didn't move. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It stood too tall to be human, shoulders too broad, legs too long. Not a shadow, not a hallucination. Its silhouette had weight, substance, presence, as if the forest itself had stopped pretending. I blinked hard. The figure vanished. The trees stood empty again, but I knew what I saw. I got in the truck and drove fast, faster than I should have on that old logging road, the tires spitting gravel behind me. I didn't slow until the ranger station appeared through the trees like a familiar island rising from a dark sea. When I pushed through the door, the other rangers turned to look at me. Their faces shifted, concern, confusion, curiosity. "Where were you?" my supervisor asked. "You didn't check in. Radio wasn't working again." I swallowed hard. "I took a wrong trail, ended up farther north than I meant to." That was all I managed. I didn't have the strength to build a convincing lie. He narrowed his eyes, but didn't press. Instead, he motioned for me to join him inside the office. When the door closed behind us, he leaned against the desk. "There's something I think you should know," he said. "Something about that area." I stiffened. "What area?" "North Ridge, old mining zone, the place you ended up." My pulse thudded painfully. "What about it?" He hesitated, and then he said the thing I feared most. "There's a cave." The word landed like a stone in my chest. "Rahia." He continued, "We don't mark it on maps anymore. Too many accidents, too many bodies we never found." I tried to keep my expression steady, but my breath hitched. Bodies? Miners went missing there in the late 1800s. More disappeared in the 1940s. Surveyors, hikers, no collapses, no evidence of a fall. Just gone. I pictured the pool, the dripping, the shadows shifting beneath the surface. "Do the locals know about it?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "They call it the Hollow Mouth." A chill swept through me so fast my skin prickled. Mouth. The cave breathing in my dream. The cave exhaling behind me. The cave speaking with a voice that wasn't singular. I steadied my hands on the edge of the table. "Why wasn't I told this sooner?" "Because we don't talk about it," he said flatly. Talking about it keeps it awake in your mind, and things awake in your mind have a habit of waking up out there. Something shifted in his voice. Fear. Not panic, not denial. A quiet fear that had settled in him long ago. The same kind I'd seen in old man Russell's eyes at the store. The same kind I now carried in my lungs. "I think you should take some time off," he added. "Clear your head." But I couldn't leave. Not when I felt watched, not when the cave had breathed my name, not when something beneath the forest had taken an interest in me. I nodded anyway. "Yeah, maybe." He looked relieved. I wasn't. That night, in my cabin on the edge of town, I sat awake long past midnight. The wind sifted through the pines outside, brushing the branches against the roof with a soft, rhythmic drag. Normally that sound comforted me, but now it made my skin crawl. At 1:14 a.m., something tapped my window. 3 slow knocks. I shot upright, breath frozen in my chest. The knocks didn't repeat. I didn't move, didn't even blink. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whatever stood outside could hear it. I reached slowly for my flashlight. My hands were trembling so badly I knocked it off the nightstand. The tapping returned. This time softer, more deliberate, like fingertips brushing the glass. My mouth went dry. The wind outside shifted, and with it came that scent, the same sour, wet smell that had chased me through the ridge and clung to the cave walls. It seeped through the cracks in the window frame, through the wood, through me. I grabbed the edge of the bed to keep from collapsing. My throat tightened, eyes watering from the stinging scent. The tapping stopped. The night grew impossibly still. And then, quiet at first, almost imperceptible, a breath. Not my own. A long, slow exhale that fogged the glass from the outside. I sat frozen, staring at the white crescent spreading across the window. Something enormous stood just beyond the thin pane, breathing softly, patiently, as if waiting for me to speak its name. My body shook so violently I felt the bed frame tremble beneath me. And then the whisper came. Not from the window, not from outside, from beneath the floor, a low resonant whisper that felt like the entire cabin was exhaling a single word directly into my bones. Not my name, a different word this time. Harsh, guttural, the same sound I'd heard in the cave, a word I didn't know but understood instinctively. Come back. The breath at the window stilled, silence folded over the cabin like snow. I stayed frozen until dawn bled into the room, soft light pushing the darkness into the corners. When I finally gathered the courage to look at the window, I saw faint streaks on the glass where something tall had stood. Not handprints, moisture marks, condensation, breath, far higher than any human mouth could reach. My body felt hollow as I forced myself to stand. Something had come to my home, had found me easily, had spoken with the same voice that rose from the cave, and beneath all that fear came a realization that made my blood run cold. It wasn't calling me back to the cave. It was calling me back because I had left. Whatever lived in the hollow mouth didn't just watch the forest, it claimed it, and now it had claimed me too. For the rest of the morning, I stood inside that small cabin like a ghost trapped in its own skin. I didn't open the door, I didn't touch the window, I didn't look at the floorboards where the whisper had risen through the wood. My breath felt foreign in my chest, as if my lungs belonged to something else entirely. By mid-afternoon, I realized something simple and terrifying. I couldn't stay here. Running wouldn't save me. Not from something that didn't walk, didn't travel, didn't follow. It simply appeared where it wanted to. The forest was no longer a place I worked. It wasn't even a place I lived. It had become an extension of whatever watched me from its roots and caves and shadows. But I also couldn't turn myself in for help. What would I say? That the woods breathed through my house? That something taller than a man had stared through my window without standing close enough to touch it? That a word from beneath the earth now lived inside my bones, echoing through every breath I took? No, help wasn't coming because no one else would accept the truth. So before the sun set, I grabbed my jacket, my flashlight, my canteen, and a small hunting knife I'd never once used in the line of duty. I opened the cabin door slowly, not wanting to startle anything that might be waiting on the other side. Nothing stood there, but the woods were watching. I could feel it, the way you feel the gaze of an animal before you spot it, the way children feel monsters in their closets before the closet doors even move. The pines leaned in too quietly. The shadows stretched in the wrong direction. The air held a pressure that pushed against my ribs. The forest wanted me back, not for punishment, not even for death. It wanted me because I had seen it. And things in the dark don't like being known without permission. My feet carried me without conscious choice, back along the dirt road, back toward the ridge lines, back toward the place locals wouldn't speak of except in half-finished sentences. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn around, to find sunlight and stay in it. But something deeper tugged me forward, something like gravity, like the pull of the tide. The closer I got to the old mining district, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind. Not even the soft creak of bending branches. The silence grew so heavy I started hearing my own blood move through my ears. When I reached the trailhead, the sky was thick with clouds, the air sharp. My breath puffed white and vanished instantly. I walked into the woods, expecting fear to choke me, expecting my knees to give out, expecting the weight of the forest to crush whatever resolve I had left. But something else happened instead. The fear sharpened, focused, transformed. It didn't paralyze me now. It steadied me. Because in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about me. The cave wasn't just calling my name. It wasn't just breathing through my window. It had been doing this for generations, to miners, to surveyors, to missing hikers, to men like old Russell who couldn't talk about what they'd seen. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I was simply next. And that realization gave me a clarity I didn't expect. I wasn't walking toward the cave to surrender. I was walking there to understand, or to end whatever legacy had been festering beneath these woods for a century. The ridge rose in front of me faster than I remembered. The trail narrowed, slipping between tight clusters of pine. And then I saw it, the dark crack in the earth, moss hanging like curtains, the air spilling from its mouth colder than the outside world. The hollow mouth. The breath of the cave touched my face. I didn't flinch, but the forest did. Branches shivered behind me. A heavy rhythmic sound stirred the air, footfalls far too spaced to be human. The pines swayed as something tall moved between them. It was here, not behind me, not in front of me, everywhere. Watching me return, I stepped into the cave. The cold swallowed me instantly. The world outside muted as if sealed behind glass. The dripping began again, slow, steady, familiar. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on those long gouges in the stone, those inhuman scratches that reached heights no person could touch. The air trembled, not wind, not movement. Breath. A deep inhalation pulled from the far chamber, drawing the air around me forward, tugging at my jacket, sliding cold across my skin. I felt the caves pull like a tide dragging a swimmer toward deeper water. I moved slowly, carefully, deeper into the throat of the earth. The tunnel walls vibrated. The echo of my footsteps warped, splitting into 3 distant versions of themselves, one ahead, one behind, one high above, as if the ceiling were walking with me. And then I heard it. A heartbeat, but not mine. Slow, heavy, measured. A pulse that belonged to something massive, something older than any tree in the forest, something with muscles like coiled stone and lungs that expanded the entire chamber when it breathed. I reached the chamber. The pool sat at its center again, black, still, waiting. But this time the surface wasn't smooth. It trembled, rippling outward in perfect concentric rings, like something beneath was rising. I stepped closer, heart hammering. The rings widened, grew jagged. A low vibration rolled through the chamber, shaking dust from the ceiling, and then the water bulged. Shape surfaced, not fully, not clearly, but enough to steal my breath. A massive silhouette beneath the waterline, long limbs coiled like roots, the faintest outline of a head, or something like a head, tilting toward me. The whispers returned, but not just around me, inside me. My name. Then that other guttural word. Then a third word I'd never heard before, one that rattled my bones like a command spoken through a cathedral's walls. The water rose again, and suddenly I understood the truth the locals had been too afraid to say. The missing hadn't been dragged away. They had been absorbed, swallowed, added to something ancient that lived between the soil and stone. This was no creature, not a yeti, not a wild man. This was a being the forest itself had grown around, a consciousness buried beneath the pines, a voice older than any human settlement, a presence that had learned to speak by listening to our fear. The forest wasn't haunted because something moved through it. The forest was haunted because something lived under it, and it remembered every name whispered into its dark. My voice trembled as I spoke, not out of courage, but out of exhaustion. What do you want from me? The chamber answered with a vibration so deep my knees buckled. A single word echoed back, the same guttural command as before. Not come back, not stay. The meaning hit me instantly. Tell. My breath caught. It didn't want me to disappear. It didn't want to claim me. Not yet. It wanted to be known. It wanted its stories carried. Its warnings spread. Its legacy whispered through generations. It wanted me to speak for it. The pool calmed slowly, the water receding, the echo faded, the breath behind me ceased, the tension in the stone loosened, as if the entire cave were exhaling its hold on me. And for a moment, only a moment, I felt something like release. I backed out slowly, carefully, never turning my back until I reached the narrow passageway. Outside the cave, the forest shifted again. A heavy shape moved between the trees, watching, waiting, but it didn't follow. Not this time. The woods were silent as I descended the ridge, but it wasn't the silence of danger anymore. It was the silence of something finished, something decided, something ancient passing a burden from itself into human hands. By the time I reached the base of the ridge, the clouds began to break. A thin band of light touched the tops of the pines. My legs trembled, my breath shook, and fear still clung to me like wet moss. But beneath the terror was something else. Understanding. I would carry these stories. I would speak the warnings the forest couldn't. I would remember the hollow mouth so no one else had to enter it blindly, because the woods don't just keep secrets. They choose who carries them. And for reasons I may never understand, the spirits of the pines, the dark beneath the ridgeline, and the ancient thing inside the earth chose me. And these stories, the ones the locals still whisper, the ones carved into stone and memory, are not just tales of fear. They are a reminder. In the heart of the pines, where silence breathes and shadows listen, the forest will always know your name, and it will never forget what you dare to know of it.